What's the scariest experience you've ever been through? At about 10 years old, I fell through ice on a pond. When I came back up, I smacked into ice instead of the hole I fell through. The water was too murky to see any light from the hole, and I thought that I was witnessing the end of my short life. I was lucky to find the opening again, but as I tried to get back up, the ice kept breaking and I'd go under again. The whole event probably lasted 30 seconds, but to me, it was a lifetime. It's been 35 years, and I'm still nervous on a frozen body of water even if cars and trucks are driving on it. I had something sort of similar. I ran towards a river, skidded on ice, fell down the bank, and landed in the water. My clothes were so heavy when they got wet that my little 7-year-old muscles couldn't get me back to the surface. Somehow my 9-year-old sister found the brute strength to yank me out of the water with just one arm. I'm still sketchy around water 20 years later. Getting a phone call at work to tell me that my wife's routine surgery had gone wrong due to an anesthetist's mistake and she was now in a coma in the ICU. I dropped everything and ran. What greeted me when I walked in was the stuff of nightmares. Tubes everywhere, machines beeping. My wife was in ICU for 23 days before they took her off life support and she died in my arms. Life has never been the same since. Not everybody experiences someone they love dying before their eyes in their arms. It's the worst thing you could experience, especially in your situation where it is utterly blindsiding and should not have happened. My mom died in my arms from pancreatic cancer. It's how I've been able to do stuff otherwise I couldn't. I already experienced the worst thing that many others will not have to face, so what could be the big deal about what I'm facing now? I'm sorry you had to watch your wife die like that, but proud that you were there. It really wrings your soul out and numbs you to the bone. You definitely can't be the same after it. One night I was working in a rural old wooden gas station. A masked man kicked the door open and robbed me with a shotgun. He was more scared than I was, which made me more scared than he was. I got him out of there with the money and all the cigarettes. The next day, the newspaper published my name and address. One news website, I don't recall if paper or TV, published an article about someone who didn't wish to be identified for fear of reprisal with not just the street name and block number, but a photo of his house with the exact street number visible. More recently, a different news outlet said they weren't going to identify the Good Samaritan who took out a shooter in one sentence and had his name in the very next sentence. I survived a chainsaw accident to the throat, March 16, 2022. Trachea, thyroid, and epiglottis, hope I spelt those right, were each into parts. The operating doc came by 2 days afterwards with huge eyes and told me about the puzzle pieces he had to put back together. I'm basically fully recovered except for my voice that sounds a bit hoarse because of nerve damage. It is slowly recovering and I am going for speech therapy. At the beginning though I did sound a bit like Lemmy Kilmister and thought about reviving Motorhead. I remember everything. So to start, we are a small, experienced team that do arborism and rope access with all the required qualifications. We had also done a special first aid course that was custom made for our potential requirements. There was no space to park a wood chipper as we were in a residential area, and there the streets are narrow and full of cars, German city. Therefore, I had to cut the branches smaller inside the trailer so that everything fits. I always do my utmost best to stay away from the sides of the trailer. I have done this many times before, but this one time, I remember feeling a punch in my throat, but it wasn't painful. There were a few seconds of confusion. I felt sometimes pulling on my fleece jacket and saw the saw hanging from my jacket. I pulled it off, put the brake on, and switched it off, kind of instinctively. Then it dawned on me that something bad happened. At that moment, my buddy in the tree, who saw it, shouted accident and abseiled. My boss was standing a few meters from the trailer and turned around to me. At that stage, I had already put one hand on my throat to close up the wound. My boss helped me out of the trailer and sat me down on the pavement. My buddy came over to help me sit up while my boss grabbed a compression gauze from the first aid box. Luckily, our van was just right there. While I held the gauze tight, my boss and the fourth guy made the emergency call. At this stage, I realized the extent of trouble I am in and did a quick self-assessment. Do I feel like passing out? No. Can I still breathe, or is blood running into my lungs? No. The strange thing is, at no stage at all did I think that I might not survive this. 6 minutes after the emergency call, everybody was there, except the press. I just saw a lot of legs from my POV. The first responder doc and her staff were absolutely amazing. The fire brigade stood next to them, and I remember the head honcho looking inside the trailer and immediately giving a correct assessment of what happened. The cops were in the background and closed off the streets. So, transport to emergency room. When I got there, like about 20 people were prepped and waiting for me. The first responder doc brought them all up to date on my condition and stats before the chief specialist took over. He had a lookie at my wound and pressed real hard. That was the first moment I felt a bit of pain. The last thing I remember him saying was propofol, and then I woke up in the ICU shortly before my wife came in. I only spent a week in hospital, and the tightest part of my day was when the tracheostomy dressing had to be changed. I must honestly say that I am very surprised with myself how I handled the whole thing. After it happened, I was totally calm and collected, and I haven't had any PTSD, although I do keep an eye on myself. My first few days in hospital, I replayed the events over and over, but from my colleagues' point of view, especially my boss. That was frightening. He was the one that could look inside my throat. I think he got affected the most by all this. Anyway, 3 weeks after all this, I was back at work again. It wasn't a problem for me to use a saw again, and a few times I have even done the same job that led to all this, obviously just being much more careful than I already am. I guess it's part of the getting over it process. Thank you all for showing interest in my story. Tick-borne encephalitis. I didn't even know a tick had bitten me and went from headache to shivers and extreme fever until I wasn't able to walk without my wife supporting me. Even reading made my head spin like crazy, and I didn't know what the reason was. This reminds me of a patient I had. We always are underpaid and understaffed. The healthcare is free, and sometimes people treat it as an all-included hotel. They tell nurses to charge their phones, buy them coffee and newspapers from the kiosk downstairs, help them with their laptop issues, etc. I get it. Not all of them can walk, and sometimes it's just so boring, but our nurses are in the constant state of burnout. So this guy gets hospitalized, no specific symptoms, just fever and feeling unwell. His wife is extremely doting and babies him while she's there. He's otherwise a strong, capable man, in his late 40s, IES. So the next day he calls and all the nurses are busy, so I go. I'm an intensive care doctor. He asks me to change his clothes, and I urge him to do it himself because he's an adult. He kind of TIs, but it soon becomes very obvious that he really can't. So he gets all the tests done, and it turns out he has tick-borne encephalitis. It was early spring, so early in fact that there was snow everywhere. Apparently, ticks don't care. Watching my 3-year-old son wither away due to leukemia to the point he was so weak he couldn't walk, sit up, talk, and we would have to hold his head in place so that he could watch Paw Patrol. He's now almost 4 and back to walking again, and seems to be winning this long, hard battle. My son had stage 4 neuroblastoma. We almost lost him several times throughout treatment, including Christmas Day 2015, while I had just miscarried our second baby 2 days before. He is now a cancer survivor, having been cancer-free for 5 years. And he now has a little sister. Watching your child fight for their life has a way of changing you. It sets your priorities straight and makes you appreciate the little moments. Sending love from one cancer parent to another. 5 years ago, we thought my father had been kidnapped for a ransom. Those 3-4 days when we thought he was being held somewhere were absolute and sheer terror. Turns out he was dead on day 1. A girl in my high school's family was kidnapped in Mexico, and they were being extorted for more and more money for months. Finally, the police found their bodies. They had been tortured to death over the course of a couple weeks. Skin flayed off, eyes gouged out, limbs amputated crudely, the whole 9 yards. I'll never forget that, and I'll never go to Mexico. I was 13 years old, and my dad had just picked me up from high school but had my grandma in the car too, so I sat in the back seat. We were driving back home, and my grandma wanted to quickly run into a shop, so we parked up outside the shop. My gran was having trouble getting up the steps out front of the shop, so my dad jumped out to help her. At that exact moment, I noticed my dad's gold chain he lost a couple of weeks ago under the seat in front of me, so ducked down and reached under to get it. As I'm trying to reach under the seat, someone got in the car. I looked up and they kinda looked like my dad from behind, so I said, "Dad." They turned around and I immediately saw it wasn't my dad. They clearly didn't realize anyone else was in the car and were a little startled, but quickly replied, "Sit back and shut up. I'll let you out in a minute." The key was still in the ignition and they started the car and peeled off. I have never really felt fear like it. All the worst kinds of thoughts rushed through my head and I was convinced they had stolen the car because I was in it, but they drove down a couple of streets and pulled over and just said, "Okay, get out." I ran back to the shop and halfway ran straight into the arms of my dad, who had been running after the car. I could literally feel the relief that he was feeling through that hug. I was in a hospital for months because of something else, couldn't get up and had already lost a ton of weight, which made me severely underweight. Then caught some kind of virus. The doctors couldn't figure out what it was and got weaker every day. I couldn't eat or drink and vomit at all the time. At some point what I spat out was entirely black, probably dried blood. I can hardly remember that time of my life, but looking in the mirror and seeing my bloodshot eyes where all the veins popped and my chin and neck with burns from the acidity in stomach fluid and my skinny arms and ribs was horrifying. I think I was around 14 at the time and was sure I'd die. It went on for days and then just stopped. We thought it was that hospital virus that happens sometimes, but apparently it wasn't. Still don't know what happened and how I survived. My son's brain surgery. He has epilepsy and had a small portion removed in 2020 to alleviate his seizures and give him a better quality of life. He spent a week with wires in his brain tracking his seizures as he had them in real time. They slowly stopped his anti-seizure meds to induce them. He had 26 in one night as he slept. Once it was enough data, they removed a portion of his brain near his speech and memory center. This was the location of his misfires. The general consensus was that he had a good chance of losing his speech and memory. His personality could disappear. After his surgery, as he was being taken back to his room, he raised his arm to touch his face. The physician told him not to, and my son said, "I'm not. I just want to touch it." He spoke before he was fully out of anesthesia. 3 days later, he was home. 3 days after that, he was being transported back for emergency surgery because of a nasty infection under his skull. The surgeon later said he was maybe 12 hours from dying if he hadn't been seen. He had no symptoms other than a gross drip. No pain, no fever, nothing. Another brain surgery and 6 weeks with a drain tube and monitor on him at home with nurse visits weekly. He is now seizure-free and on a much lower dose of meds than he was previously. 1,500 daily down to 100 milligrams. I spent a month in the children's center helplessly watching my son slip in and out of consciousness and have hundreds of seizures. The possibility of him waking up with no memories and no way to speak was horrifying to me as his father. So the scariest moment in my life, and keep in mind I've been shot, stabbed, and beaten, was almost losing my 16-year-old child 3 times in 1 month. My mother woke me up in the middle of the night to tell me she had been robbed and stabbed. I had to stay with her while paramedics arrived, helped her clean her wound, and put pressure on it. After she was taken to the hospital, the cops told me it was most likely self-inflicted. I will never forget the feeling I had when she told me, and the sight of it. I will also never forget the feeling of being told my mother was suicidal to the point of stabbing herself. One of the most terrifying, troubling nights of my life, and unfortunately I have more stories that are wildly similar to that. I've posted this in a thread a long time ago, but here you go. Memory loss. I was 18 at the time and crashed while downhill longboarding with some friends. They say I was only out for a minute or so, but to this day I still have no memory from the moment of impact till about 30-45 min. Later, I came to in my friend's car as he drove me to the hospital. It was such a bizarre feeling, dreamlike. I remember thinking that I had just woken up, but I couldn't remember when I went to sleep. I couldn't remember the last thing I did before sleeping. I didn't even know what day it was, or month for that matter. I was pretty sure it was summer, but that was it. Then I realized the pain. My knees were bleeding, my hands swollen, my foot was somehow wrong, and my head was pounding. I remember just panicking and started to sob because I couldn't figure out what was happening. Maybe one of the more tame stories here, but it took me probably a half an hour to an hour to start regaining memories, but that period of just not knowing was utterly terrifying. Peas. I was wearing a helmet, and I'm convinced it's the only reason I'm writing this today. My beloved dog, a dock diver and completely amazing swimmer and practiced athletic retriever, swam off into one of the Great Lakes, the mighty Huron. He had been swimming daily in our more calm inland lakes and was very fit. He made it into the shipping channel and I was petrified. He was chasing a sailboat. Wouldn't come back. No jet ski key at our rental. Little dude swam all the way to Charity Island in the middle of Lake Huron, about 10 miles. You cannot usually see Charity Island from Point Ogres, only the lighthouse. It's a fluke he found it in open water. I suspect he chased a pleasure boat there, as it is a tourist designation. I was devastated. Anyway, he was rescued, tired but happy, and brought back to us by good Samaritans via his tags and imprinted collar. He was said to have enjoyed his boat ride and slept like a log. He visited all 5 Great Lakes in his lifetime and never swam off again. He lived to be just 5 weeks shy 17 years old. His ashes were committed to the sandy tides of the mighty Huron, along with my heart, Rip Kirby, my forever pal. I'll see you in the surf once again. Had a few friends out by Riptide and quickly lost at sea. This happened early in the day and the search parties set out, but all we knew was that they were pulled out quick. We had hope initially that they would be recovered ragged or with minor injuries as they were fine swimmers. It took over 3 hours to get the first call. They rolled in one by one with hours in between. Each time they were found dead. You still hold hope though for the others. After the third came in dead, we were crushed but still holding hope for the rest. This went the course of 2 days and was a sustained trauma rather than a single event. Not one was saved. This is near top to the most terrifying incident in my life. I won't go into beyond that because I don't want to undo work I've done on my mental health and I can't talk about them without reliving the experience. I will say this, though, there are things you don't recover from and it's easy to lose hope, but hope is sometimes the only thing that can save your life. No matter the situation, protect hope at all costs. At a very secluded cabin. Look for fallen tree on left. Now there's a huge boulder. Drive into the bush, you'll reach small clearing in about 3 minutes. Now veer right at the 3 fallen trees kinda place. No electricity, no phone service, no people. Just me and my young daughter. Went into town for more supplies. As we drove through the bush and came into a clearing, there were 2 vehicles and 6 men. No way forward, no way back. They didn't wave or smile. 2 of them talked while watching us. One said something to the other men, and they moved their trucks to let us by. About a month later, I was contacted by police wanting a description of the men we'd seen. A body had been found nearby, and they suspected it was a drug deal gone wrong. My 6-year-old brother died mysteriously. I was 12. A short while afterwards, weeks maybe, my mother and stepfather got into a fight after a night at the bar. I woke up to hearing my mother scream my name to go get the gun. I ran to their bedroom to their closet to get a shotgun and run to the living room where he was beating her up. I pointed the gun at him and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. It wasn't loaded. He came at me and knocked me out. I woke up the next morning in bed. I walk into the living room and my mom is scrubbing blood off the walls. He sits me on his lap and tells me he's sorry and loves us so much. My father later gets full custody of me in 1989 after I turned 13 and the summer after my 14th birthday. 1 month before starting high school, my stepfather beat my mom to death. He got second-degree manslaughter and served 120 days, let out early for being a model prisoner. I was about 8 and slipped on a slippery rock into a small canyon with a rushing river. I remember being slammed against boulders and trying to claw my way from the freezing current. My mom was screaming and running alongside the river trying to throw a long dog leash to me, but she wasn't fast enough. I was swept downstream until I luckily got hung up on another boulder. Thankfully, I managed to take these hits with my body and not my head, and it gave my mom the chance to throw me the line and pull me out. We were camping in a remote area, and I probably should have gone to the hospital because I know now I was clearly in shock. My hands and legs were all cut up from the rocks, and I needed to be wrapped in a sleeping bag and put beside the fire where I shivered for hours. My wife went past her due date, so her doctor decided to induce the pregnancy. It did not go well. After a dozen hours of no progress, the hospital told us that if we didn't do an emergency C-section, our son would likely die. The whole thing was a blur. I barely remember going to the operating room. My feet were like lead the whole time. Outwardly, I was keeping it together, but inside, it was sheer panic. Thankfully, we were at a top-notch hospital and the C-section went great. However, when we got to the postpartum room, it was pretty clear something was wrong with my son. When babies are born, they kind of look like little old prune men and not chunky Stay Puft marshmallows. So you can imagine the concern we had when we see his ribcage outlines every time he gasps for breath while pumping his tiny little chest in and out. We alerted the nurse and she went to the center station to figure out what to do. I overheard her, from inside our room, emphatically telling the doctor on call that he needed to be moved to the NICU ASAP. You know, in movies when a character experiences a moment of panic, time slows down, noise becomes garbled, and they just kind of drift. That happened to me. The nurse pulled me out of the room and explained what was going to happen, and I am just trying to keep it together as I listen. They informed me that because my wife was still recuperating, she would not be able to go up into the NICU yet, so it was just me at like 3 o'clock in the morning having to endure them putting needles and IVs into this tiny little life we had made. He ended up being fine, just a little extra fluid in his lungs, and we were out in for days, which is nothing compared to many of the parents in a NICU. This was and still is the scariest experience of my life. I don't know if I can pick which experience was the scariest, because I've had a bunch and they were scary in different ways. One that sticks out though is being awake for an ECT treatment while under a paralytic when I was a teenager. Basically, the anesthesia didn't kick in, but the paralytic did, and I couldn't breathe, move, or speak to let them know I was awake. Not being able to breathe was the terrifying part because they get your O2 levels up and then stop pumping oxygen for the rest of the treatment, so it felt like I was suffocating. I kept trying to wiggle my toes to let them know I was awake, but I couldn't move anything. I went unconscious when they induced the seizure, and when I woke up, I started sobbing hysterically. They didn't make the same mistake again, but I'm still terrified of going under for procedures. I was drugged by someone in Vegas on a girls' trip. They kept insisting we drink their alcohol even though girls drank free at this bar. Not sure how it happened, but assuming he slipped something in my drink. He had a super creepy brother that at the time just seemed introverted, but looking back should have tipped us off. The guy wasn't overly pushy, but stayed around us quite a bit. Made comments to my friend about how even though I had a boyfriend, he didn't understand because he liked me as if I was property. She picked up on enough red flags that she got us to leave. She'd asked me to take my shoes off because she said she felt we might have to run. These guys really scared her, so hard to put into words. When we left, I was hallucinating and doing some really embarrassing things that I won't even say as an anonymous person. She said I would go from being really with it to being like a loose noodle on the floor of the elevator, and she worried we wouldn't get back to our room. When we finally did make it back, she said I insisted all the people in our room leave. There were no people. She had to change me and put me on the toilet. I was a puking rag doll. I woke up the next morning with what I can only describe as a complete blackout. What I would picture going to sleep for surgery like. There were no bits and pieces. It was all black. I'd had 2 drinks before we ran into this person. I still have no idea what his and his brother's intentions were, but it makes me sick. I flew home on the next available flight.